Supposed biblical error. Did Jesus get the 10 Commandments wrong? In Mark chapter 10, Mark recounts the story of the rich young ruler coming to Jesus and asking what he must do to get into the kingdom of heaven. Mark says that Jesus responded with, "You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." Skeptics can be quick to point out that the phrase "do not defraud" is not one of the 10 Commandments from the Pentateuch, also referred to as the Decalogue. So they claim Jesus was trying to list some of the commandments of the Decalogue and accidentally stated "do not defraud" was one of them. So this means Jesus or Mark was unaware of what the 10 Commandments actually were. But this is assuming more than what the text ever states. First, the Greek word used for commandments is not a specific word that necessarily has to only refer to the commandments of the Decalogue. In Matthew 5, Jesus uses the word to refer to all the commandments of the Torah and prophets. In Mark 12, Jesus is asked which is the greatest commandment. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." And then he says the second greatest commandment is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Both are found in the Torah, but neither is found in the Decalogue. So the term commandment doesn't only refer to those of the Decalogue. And it is never stated in Mark 10 that Jesus was intending to only cite what is in the 10 Commandments. In fact, the implication is the rich young ruler was claiming he had faithfully kept all the laws of the Torah. And in the Torah, we do see the teaching of do not defraud. Leviticus 19:13 states, "You shall not defraud or oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning." Deuteronomy 24 states, "You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin." So the commandment of not defrauding is definitely in the Torah and also taught throughout the writings of the prophets. But skeptics could assert the commandment to not defraud is still out of place. The other commandments in Mark 10 imply this is a reference to the Decalogue, not other parts of the Torah. In other words, on the surface, the commandment to not defraud seems out of place given the other commandments of this passage. Well, it actually is not out of place, because this type of literature of expanding upon the Decalogue to drive home a point specific to a situation was already done before in prophetic literature. Richard Hicks says that Jesus is likely following a pattern found in the book of Malachi and mimicking the prophetic discernment found there, where we see a similar construction of references to the Decalogue, along with the commandment to not defraud. "Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who defraud the hired worker in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourn and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts." Malachi is attacking elites in Judea who were oppressing those who were helpless, but he alludes to the commandments in the Decalogue while including a reference to defrauding, which is very similar to what we see in Mark 10. Hicks says, "What distinguishes Malachi 3 is that in addition to Mark's prior intertextuality, its placement in verse 5 comes as it does in Mark among several allusions to the Decalogue and within a cotext that touches on poverty." Richard Hicks and Joel Marcus argue Jesus is intentionally bringing this commandment up because Jesus' prophetic ability to discern sin required it. In other words, the commandment to not defraud was specifically tailored for this rich man. Hicks also suggests there are allusions to Malachi throughout Mark, and there probably is a similar allusion happening in Mark 10, where the teacher blends commandments of the Decalogue with a commandment against oppressing or defrauding the poor, which does seem to make sense given the context. Remember that the story doesn't begin by telling us the man who approached Jesus was rich. That is not revealed until the end of the story. The inclusion of "do not defraud" was likely placed in there on purpose to hearken to the sin of the rich man, namely a subtle implication that he acquired his wealth at the expense of the poor. Jesus' statement, "You lack one thing," was meant to refer back to the commandment he uttered of "do not defraud." Hicks says, like lawbreakers in Malachi, Mark's rich man implicates his guilt when he cannot stand in the Lord's sight, yet he falsely maintains his innocence via the catchword link. Thus his statement is promptly overturned by Jesus' reply that he fails one thing, which points back to Jesus' one addition to the Decalogue and forms a phonological relationship with it. So presenting aspects of the Decalogue, along with commandments against defrauding the poor, is already in the background knowledge of Jesus and Mark, given that we find it in Malachi. So given this context, the structure of Mark 10:19 is not out of place or implies a misunderstanding of what's in the Decalogue. Prophetic literature already displayed a theme of blending other commandments with commandments of the Decalogue to attack those who defraud the poor. This is also the structure we should expect to find in Mark. Allusions to prophetic literature woven into specific stories is a common theme in this gospel. Deborah Krauss says, the placement of traditions in the narrative functions as an implicit commentary on the characters and solutions in the gospel story. W.S. Vorster says, allusions to and quotations from the Old Testament are usually absorbed into Mark's story in such a manner that, except for a few cases, form part of the story stuff. They are embedded into the story that, if it were not for those references in the margins and a knowledge of the Old Testament, the reader would not have noticed that Mark uses an allusion or a quotation. But another objection could be that Mark never says that the rich man was actively defrauding the poor, only that he had great wealth, which may have come from honest means. However, Michael Peppard also adds cultural context to help us understand why Jesus would implicitly accuse the rich man of defrauding the poor. The ancient economic world was far different from our modern capitalist system and not nearly as beneficial. Surpluses were rare, and wealth was typically gained at the expense of the poor and hired workers. There were no markets in antiquity in the sense that we moderns think of markets. Production was localized and oriented towards local consumption, and therefore usually afforded no surplus. The main breach in these normal reciprocal relations existed between those with land and the vast majority without. In other words, there was little chance one would become rich in the ancient world without defrauding the poor. So Peppard concludes by saying, Jesus' clever adaptation of the Decalogue's commandments about interpersonal relationships was neither a mistake nor shorthand for another part of the Torah. The commandment "do not defraud" was in fact the main point of the encounter, a prophetic indictment intensifying a halakhic expectation. Now one might ask why Matthew and Luke removed the phrase "do not defraud" in their retelling of this story. Well, it's hard to know what an author's intent was, but it may have just been an attempt to simplify the story. As Mike Licona highlights, within the ancient cultural context, exact wording was not necessary, and authors were expected to paraphrase and summarize. One could rephrase and paraphrase as they saw fit to best pass on the narration. Statements could be turned into questions. Words that could be more appropriate to pass on the message could be substituted. Because passing on the message and making sure your audience understood what happened was more important than exact wording. Either way, Matthew and Luke's accounts do not imply Mark was in error, especially given the background knowledge of what we find in Malachi. So instead of this passage revealing that Mark or Jesus probably did not know what was in the Decalogue, ironically, it more likely reveals Jesus had knowledge of the prophets and was able to weave in allusions to Malachi. Instead of this being an error in Mark, it actually indicates better knowledge of the scriptures than what modern critics have.